Farewell, My Miko by Michael Jordan. In 100 years, the world is bright and clean. Just throw garbage in a vat of slime and pull power out. Everything is electric, even the people. And yet, some things never change. Toyotomi Ayumu lived in an abandoned shrine. Too primitive for most people, but it suited him. He liked seeing bamboo outside his window instead of a slum. Nights like tonight, he opened the shutters and let the sound of the rain drown out the noise of traffic. Watching the drops glistening on the leaves, he could almost imagine he was back in 1820 instead of 2320. Of course, he'd have to clear out if the owner ever checked up on the place, but he wasn't worried. His Miko was kneeling across the table, pouring tea. She looked like something out of another century, too. Ayumu had always thought the tea ceremony was awesomely stupid. He didn't even like tea. But it was amazing to watch her, so lovely and so focused. She didn't hurry, even though she was in a hurry. It was almost time for them to go. She had his outfit hanging up to air. The garment on the rack was so beautiful it was scary. Gray, embroidered with a pattern of waves in navy blue. The silk glowed in the dim light. It was probably antique, judging by the cut, and couldn't have cost less than 1,000,000 yen, maybe even 10 million. He sipped the tea and said, "Traditional dress? I could wear a suit, you know. I have one. A good one, French." She covered her mouth and giggled, like he'd made a joke. So he continued, "They'll all be wearing suits." She smiled and poured more tea. "All the more reason you should be properly dressed. The daimyo will take it as a sign of respect, and they will not mistake who they are dealing with." "Oh, please, he's just a gang lord, not a daimyo." Still, she was right about the effect it would have, the cunning little bitch. He adored her, even if she was crazy. She shrugged. Clearly she didn't see much difference between the two. To her, they were both just well-armed mortals with delusions of grandeur. Whichever. He may not recognize what you are, but you must not allow him to suppose he is your equal. He rolled his eyes. "Not again. I'm not a god," he told her. Again, as if she ever listened. She raised her eyes. "No, just an incredibly old man?" His lips tightened. "Yes, I'm old, but you don't look it." He pretended not to notice that she'd interrupted him. "Humans do get old, you know. I was a regular kid. I had parents and I went to school, all that stuff. I'm human." She opened her mouth to contradict. "You would not call me a god if you knew what I was thinking." He glared, but he was actually thinking about how hot she looked in her silly priestess outfit. He imagined reaching out to her and jerking the shoulders of her kimono down, trapping her arms, and then jerking again at her waist until the cord of her hakama snapped and she was bare from the waist down. In 2 seconds he'd be on her, roughly, pounding her into the ground until she screamed. He got hard just thinking about it. Nothing godlike about it. She froze, and her eyes went huge, as if she really did know what he was thinking. Maybe she did, because, despite all her pretending, she was the one who was a god. She tried to act human, but she wasn't very good at it. She'd given herself away 100 times. So, no hot sex on the tea table. Gods didn't do sweaty things. He sighed. Time to get dressed. The rain let up, so he didn't have to worry about getting the 1,000,000 yen kimono wet. The street was strictly 23rd century, loud and garishly lit, with a limo waiting, a big, expensive Swedish car with a hologram of a chauffeur in the front. It delivered them to a posh hotel where you had to pass security just to speak to the doorman. A live doorman, that's how expensive the place was. He turned to Miko. She giggled behind her hand. Well, we can't show up at the meeting without a present, can we? But you're too important to talk to servants. Just let me go ahead. Somehow, by the time she reached the electronic armor surrounding the door, she'd changed. Suddenly, she was wearing absurdly high heels and a slinky Parisian gown that covered very little. Her breasts, he noticed with amusement, had grown significantly larger, and her hair was tied up on her head and laced with jewels. She didn't set off a single alarm. Whatever she said to the doorman, he couldn't open the door fast enough. And while he was staring enraptured down her cleavage, Ayumu strolled into the lobby and pressed the button for the elevator. Still no alarms. They went up, and when the elevator opened at the top, he found a small robot standing guard. Not a military model, but still a bit much for a hotel corridor. Its head swiveled toward them. "Your identification, please," it droned. Had to be an old model. Modern robots had better speech programming. Miko, back in her priestess outfit, offered the robot a data card. It scanned the supposed ID, and scanned it, and scanned it. It was still scanning as Miko walked past and opened the door to a suite. The man inside jumped up from a circle of floating virtual screens, waving the screens away with one hand and reaching behind him with the other. Miko bowed humbly. So Ayumu asked politely, "May we come in?" The man was still searching behind him for a weapon or an alarm, but in the meanwhile he was willing to play along politely. "To what do I owe the honor?" Ayumu presented a card, forcing the man to bring his hand out into the open. "Please forgive the intrusion, but I heard you were a connoisseur, and I have an item you might like." The guy wasn't happy. Well, of course not. But he continued to go along. "What sort of item?" Miko reached down into the voluminous folds of her hakama and withdrew Ayumu's sword. Oh, clever, magical Miko. It shouldn't have been possible to get a weapon into the building, no matter how much the doorman wanted to see her chest. The robot should have gunned them down before the elevator doors even opened. But there it was in her hands. Must be nice to be a god. Their unwilling host caught his breath. He drew the sword a few inches from its scabbard and held it up to the light. "Magnificent," he whispered. Ayumu's sword was, indeed, a work of art, centuries old. He had paid dearly for it when he was young. Seeing it now in another man's hands sent a chill of jealous anger down his spine. The man laid it out on the table and summoned a data screen. A shaft of sparkling light played down over the blade. He whistled faintly at the results of the scan and looked up, smiling. "Oh, thank you for coming. This is wonderful. How much are you asking?" Funny how greed made people stupid. This guy had known 5 minutes before that he should not turn his back on strangers who had somehow bypassed his robot. But when he saw treasure, he dropped his guard. He turned back toward the sword. Ayumu dropped a hand lightly onto the hilt. And then the sword was cutting up sharply and slicing hard, almost entirely severing the man's head. Ayumu turned off the line and away toward the window, while the body was still between him and the blade. Before the head was quite severed, he dropped the sword and stepped back, pulling a curtain in front of him. Dropping his sword in mid-stroke was disrespectful, to say the least. Plus, it made for a messy kill. Ayumu didn't like messy kills, but he was not getting bloodstains on a 1,000,000-yen kimono. Miko was less particular. She darted forward with a bag, presumably waterproof, in her hand to pluck up the head. It didn't come free at first, so when the gushing blood stopped, Ayumu cut the last bit of neck free. On their way out the door, he asked, "Who was that guy?" She shrugged. "I forget his name. Somebody the gang lord didn't like. They passed the robot, still scanning her ID. No alarms had been sounded, so no one contested their exit. Miko fell into the seat of the car and raised a hand to one temple. At Ayumu's glance, she sat back up again. Sorry, sir. All those electronics give me such a headache. She leaned forward to speak to the chauffeur, just as if he were real. The Camellia Club, please. As you wish, miss, replied the chauffeur, sounding almost human. It had a much better voice synthesizer than the robot upstairs, which was probably still scanning Miko's card. The Camellia was tucked away discreetly on a busy street, just a dark building with heavily curtained windows, distinguished only by the two shiny stars above the entry. Although just outside there were enough touts encouraging customers to make up for a dozen neon signs. Beyond the double doors at the top of the stairs, they were greeted by a dark-eyed lady, no longer young but still handsome, in an elegant sari. Beyond her, Ayumu glimpsed a large, softly lit space. Low tables were scattered about on cream-colored carpet, surmounted by soft leather couches. Clusters of unattached girls, all provocatively dressed, stood around, pretending to listen to the singer and chatting with each other. The greeter shot a surprised glance at Miko, but smiled and bowed, politely blocking entry while fervently assuring them of their welcome. Oh shit, thought Ayuma. I'm going to have to pay her. I hope Miko-chan has some money. Aloud he said, Delighted to be here, miss. I think I'm expected? The Inagawa party? But of course. Right this way, please, if you'll follow me. She took his arm and gestured forward. He suppressed a sigh of relief. Inagawa-san particularly asked me to look out for you. She led them through the room slowly, letting him check out the unattached girls. Only when it was clear that he was uninterested did she conduct him to a private room. 4 men and as many pretty girls rose at Ayumu's entrance. The 3 young men were wearing suits, as Ayumu had expected. The elder wore traditional dress, but not as fine as Ayumu's. They all bowed, and the elder said, Welcome, Toyotomi-san. You do us honor. Ayumu and Miko bowed in return. Under cover of the bow, Miko whispered faintly, There's a lot of scanning going on in here. They've all got neural nets. Not at all, Inagawa-sama, replied Ayumu. It is you who honor me with your invitation. In fact, he rose and pressed Miko forward. I am hoping you will accept a token of my respect. She bowed deeply, setting the bag on the table. The elder opened the drawstring, looking inside. He waved a hand over it as he went on looking. Ayumu was reminded of the guard robot scanning Miko's card, trying to resolve incomprehensible data. Finally, Inagawa raised his head. Toyotomi-san, I will be frank with you. I had grave doubts about this meeting, about the whole project we meet to discuss. He smiled faintly. In the end, I only agreed to meet you because I liked your name. I thought your whole clan was extinct. But this gift... He looked down again, sighed, and closed the bag. This token, as you call it, has touched my heart. Clearly you are worthy of your name, and I can speak with you in confidence. He sat and flicked his fingers dismissively at the girls, who topped up everybody's drinks and left. Inagawa sipped his scotch before remarking, Are you familiar with the Kodakai? Ayumu nodded. A small Yakuza family in the north. Inagawa's nostrils flared. I fear I must disagree. They are not Yakuza. Yakuza are businessmen, more aggressive than most perhaps, but honorable. They do not throw bombs and kill children. The Kodakai are just scum. scum that give their betters a bad name. And now they have set up an office in Tokyo. Dreadful, murmured Ayumu. It is said. Inagawa paused to choose polite words with care. That nothing on this earth can protect those who offend you. That your enemies do not merely die, they disappear. Like magic. He patted the bag in front of him. Will this gentleman's name be in tomorrow's news? Ayumu chuckled. No, but that's scarcely magical. His colleagues will not want to admit that he was here. The hotel will not want to admit how lax their security was. So it will turn out that he took a leave of absence. Oh, excellent. But he is only one man. Inagawa frowned. Surely an entire office, 25, 30 people, they could not all go on a leave of absence. Ayumu reflected. No, not all. Some could. Others could run off with their secretaries or suffer accidents. They would have to be entirely convincing accidents, said Inagawa. There must not be a hint of Yakuza involvement. Small and nasty though they are, if the Kodakai were to die by our hands, the other gangs would have to avenge them. There would be war. We cannot have another war with the Olympics so soon. The secret police would disappear us all. Ayumu nodded. Simplest then if they truly disappeared. But 25 or 30, I'd need a while. And a bottomless grave, he reflected. But before the Games, the Olympics honor all Japan, so it must be before the Games. Again, he thought. Again, he nodded. Yes, before the Games. Inagawa almost laughed out loud. Relief washed across his face, and years seemed to drop from his shoulders. If you could make this happen, you would do all Tokyo, all Japan, a great service, and the Inagawa Kai would not forget. No token of our esteem would be sufficient to express our appreciation. Ayumu smiled. Forgive my presumption, but there is only one token that interests me, Inagawa-sama. He sipped his own drink. Very good Scotch. If your family could adopt me. There was a shocked silence. You would give up your beautiful name? He took a deep breath. Cards on the table. The Toyotomi were once samurai, but they are long dead, and in their absence I am just a ronin. I have skills, I have pride, but I am not respected because I represent no one. I want a family. Money is immaterial. Of course, whispered Inagawa. I should have guessed. If you will excuse me. He extended his hands before him and placed his palms together as if praying. He closed his eyes and became utterly still. But beneath his eyelids, his pupils continued to move. His sleeves fell back to reveal a tattoo of a snake running along each arm. The tattooed snakes turned their heads and flicked their tongues, then slithered forward until their heads protruded onto the backs of his hands, while the tails looped around to circle his wrists. Miko, who had stepped back unobtrusively, gave a faint cry, huddling down with her hands clapped over her ears. At last Inagawa opened his eyes, lowered his hands. He looked weary and disoriented, but his voice was clear. Yes, we would be proud to call you our son. It wasn't as difficult as it sounded. They were just thugs. Miko dropped by their office, pretending to inquire about a hostess position. Really to bug the place, of course. The Kodakai had no clubs, of course, but they clustered around her drooling. One fool tried to follow her out, so she led him to Ayumu. A half dozen more tried to throw their weight around at a freight company on protected turf. Somehow the gang lord didn't get the word in time to intervene before the police showed up in extreme force. One of the Kodakai was even stupid enough to shoot a cop, so the cops shot back and killed most of them. Plus, the two that made it to jail talked, so three more of their colleagues ended up joining them. Miko's bugs made it easy to track them and pick them off one by one, and then cart the bodies back and drop them down the well behind the shrine. That was a nuisance. He would prefer to dump bodies in the algae vats feeding the power plants under the city, but he didn't have access. He was in the process of arranging a meet with an official who could sell him an employee entry code, but the intricate ritual of bribes and courtesies could not be hurried. In the meanwhile, Miko chanted, burned incense, and shook rattles to appease the spirits. The remaining Kodakai took elaborate precautions. They found a few of the bugs. They started traveling in pairs, but two of them were still nowhere near enough to take a Yumu. They called home begging for reinforcements, which never arrived. One Kodakai came down sick with something that looked like an algae infection. The Board of Health slapped a quarantine on the premises, locking everyone they could catch in an isolation ward. Unfortunately, there was a getaway exit, so 6 escaped, including the boss. Ayumu would have to find them. But first he spent a long day acquiring a government biohazard container, one of the ones hospitals use to ship contaminated wastes to the power plant for algae processing. When he returned to the shrine, he didn't see Miko. When he stepped inside looking for her, the whole world seemed to explode into noise and chaos. Luckily, he was still bent over removing his shoes. A roof beam flung across the room at head height. It smashed into splinters beside him. He dropped down, coiled and rolled, coming back up to his feet a safe distance away. Behind him, there was nothing left but stone steps leading to a pile of rubble. Sighing, he pulled up a block from the middle stair to retrieve his sword. He'd have to find someplace else to hide it. Carrying weapons in public could get you in trouble. Inconceivable that Miko could have betrayed him. But she wasn't here, and she was the only one who knew where he lived. He started walking. It didn't occur to him that walking blindly ahead was a peculiar way to search for someone. It was the only way to find Miko. He walked past cheap bars and cheaper clubs, past drunks and junkies. There were no police around to hassle him about the sword, just panhandlers and ugly prostitutes. A few beggars crowded too close and ended up hurt. He walked until he reached the warehouse. A shot rang out, but the bullet whizzed by his head, and the trajectory pinpointed the shooter. That guy didn't get 3 feet. Deeper inside the building, a voice cried, "Shit, it's that Russian!" A lot of foot scuffling, 2 crashes, and a clanging sound. Sounded like all of them. Most had ducked behind crates, but one was upstairs, north side. Ayumu snagged up a phone from the body, along with the gun. So they thought he was Russian. Interesting. Had he just stumbled into someone else's fight? The phone vibrated. Could they be that stupid? Perhaps they could. He turned off the video and took the call. A message from Kazu. "Hoki, you okay?" "No," he texted. "Hurt bad. Will you come get me?" "Are you crazy? You're going to have to hang in until we take this guy down." The call went 3-way. Someone called Blade 2 joined in to text, "We're not going to be able to take him. We should just clear out." "No," texted Ayuma, still posing as Hoki. "You can't leave me." "Well, of course we can take him," Kazu texted back. "He's only one guy." "One guy that just walked away from a bomb," pointed out Blade 2. Someone called Taro joined the call to text, "It was Yuta set the bomb. He must have screwed up." Apparently Yuta was watching the call too. "Did not," he protested. "I triple checked. That Russian's got superpowers or something." Russian again. No matter. He knew where they were now, or most of them. When he went into the warehouse to look, Blade 2 was nowhere near the place his GPS had said he'd been. So he was the smartest. Or maybe the second smartest. The guy upstairs had left his phone off. So he was still just somewhere upstairs. The main floor was a maze of stacked crates with narrow alleyways between them. Kazu probably thought he'd taken a defensible position, tucked into an inaccessible niche between two stacks. But in fact, he'd boxed himself into a corner. He never even saw Ayumu. Yatu and Taro saw him, but only for a second. It took a good deal of winding through the alleys, not to mention backtracking from numerous cul-de-sacs, but eventually Ayumu found his way to some iron stairs bolted to one wall. If he could reach the next level, it would be easier to spot Blade 2 from above. But he'd be a target while he was climbing. Was the man upstairs watching, or had he run? He hadn't fired while Ayuma hunted down his colleagues. Another crash, and a faint sob as Blade 2 figured out that he was screwed. He had tried to crawl between several unevenly stacked crates, and one had come down on him. Ayumu dropped to his knees and looked Blade 2 in the eye. The thug had spirit. He'd been the smartest one on that text message. He might be worth talking to. But apparently Blade 2 didn't want to talk. He just lifted his gun and aimed it right at Ayumu. So Ayumu chopped off his head. And damned if he didn't reach for the gun with his left hand. Ayumu chopped off the other hand. Blade 2 looked down at the stumps, watching the blood pump with a bewildered expression. He was bleeding out fast. "Look at me," said Ayumu. "Do I look Russian?" Blade 2 didn't seem to understand the question. "Why do you keep calling me Russian?" Blade 2 smiled, pleased to have some understanding penetrate his fading wits. "Because you're fighting for them, of course." He tried to shake his head, but his neck wobbled. "You ought to be faithful to Japan." He dropped his face into the pool of blood and died. The phone vibrated again. Somebody called Bad Bird, and Bad Bird had attached a video. The text read, "The girl's not dead yet, if that matters to you." The cover pic showed Miko bleeding and sobbing. She'd been cut and beaten and burned. "Poor fake," he texted. "Think so? This is live." The video popped up almost life size. A stick was poking Miko, and an off-screen voice said, "Tell him it's you, bitch." "Won't," she wailed. "He wouldn't compromise his work for me anyway." It still had to be a fake. She was a god. But it was a very good fake. A very good fake. Bad Bird switched to voice. "I'm not asking much. You let me go, I let her go. Even trade." "So you can go kill Russians? Why? What's in it for you?" "What do you think? Money. Lots of money. As long as the Chechens get blamed." There was a pause. "We put all this behind us. I could get you in on it." "You're good. I could use you. Lots of money." Ayumu nodded to himself. The Chechen Republic and the Russians were already at daggers drawn across their nebulous border. So far, no amount of international intervention had helped. There had been hope that the Olympics might help bring them closer to making peace. But if Russians died at the Olympics and the Chechen Republic was blamed, there'd be no way out of it. There'd be real war, not gang war. Which did mean armloads of money. But the Olympics would be ruined. Japan would lose face. How much money would it take to set that right? How much is lots? He said, looking for an alternate route to the catwalk at the edge of the second floor. You can't count that high. Ayuma smiled. There were some crates piled high along the wall, a long way from the stairs, and some cables were hanging down. Come on up and we'll talk. Let her go first. Ayuma was just talking to keep Bad Bird distracted, in case he made a noise. Some of the crates weren't steady, this blade too, it learned, and the catwalk might creak when he grabbed it. But there was a pause. I'm not really holding her anymore, see? The video tried to pop up again, and Ayuma had to let go of the catwalk to key the phone to keep the video on the small screen. Miko was lying very still. She looks dead. Ayuma allowed his voice to sound angry. But she's not, honest. Bad Bird sounded gratifyingly scared. See? There was a groan. Bad Bird must have poked her again. But Ayuma was too busy swinging his legs up and around the edge of the catwalk to look. And then he had only to walk up quietly behind Bad Bird, who was pointing the phone at Miko with one hand while watching the stairs. He must have made a sound. Bad Bird turned, even got off a few shots. But bullets were not as hard to duck as most people thought, not if you were moving fast enough. Ayuma moved very fast, but not so fast that he killed Bad Bird with one cut. He wanted it to hurt. He wanted Bad Bird to watch it coming. Then he knelt by Miko. She was barely breathing. I am so sorry, Master, she whispered. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I never meant to betray you. I thought I was strong enough to face death for you. After all, I've been through it before. But the pain, I couldn't handle the pain. What was she talking about? Miko-chan, why did you let them do this to you? She made a noise, a laugh or a sob or a cough. You think I let them do this? Well, why didn't you stop them with your powers? She stared at him. Don't play stupid games with me. I've seen your powers. You do amazing, impossible things all the time. She continued to stare until she coughed again. But they're not my powers. They're yours. I'm just your instrument. I only have the power to do whatever you tell me to do. Oh, Master, did you forget again? Her voice grew very faint, but she smiled and lifted a hand to stroke his cheek. You are a god, a beautiful, deadly god. The hand fell, and he could hardly hear her. Thank you for bringing me back. My time with you is so much better than my real life. I loved watching you kill the guys who murdered me. He drew the limp body into his lap, willing it to feel no pain while she died. Was he really a god? If he watched for her fleeing spirit, could he bring it back again? But he didn't see any spirits, not hers or any others. So he sighed, rising to his feet. Time to get on with disposing of the bodies. The end.